The Zeltrax were a species that prided themselves on their collection of exotic pets. Across the galaxy, they were known for acquiring rare and peculiar creatures, placing them in lavish enclosures, and observing them with a mixture of scientific curiosity and aristocratic delight. They had every imaginable species, feathered, scaled, multi-limbed, and even those that communicated telepathically. But there was one creature they had yet to claim, a human. The decision to acquire one wasn't made lightly. The Zeltrax prided themselves on only selecting creatures that were aesthetically pleasing, amusing, or otherwise interesting. Humans were not the strongest or fastest creatures they had encountered, but they were undeniably fascinating. Their primitive society had managed to produce complex tools, build vast civilizations, and most importantly, display entertainingly irrational behaviors. The idea of keeping one as a pet was tantalizing. After an extensive review of Earth's population, they selected Ethan. His physical build was considered ideal, not too large, not too small. His behavior was analyzed for compatibility, independent, clever, and occasionally unpredictable. That, they assumed, would add to the entertainment value. When the time came, Ethan was effortlessly extracted from his home in a painless, undetectable operation. He would awaken in a paradise of his own, free from worry, where he would be cared for and observed with affection. The Zeltrax were quite pleased with themselves. Ethan's first moments aboard the Zeltrax mothership were a blur of confusion. He awoke in a space that looked eerily familiar, a pristine replica of an upscale Earth apartment, complete with furniture, books, and even a fake window that simulated a pleasant view of rolling hills. His confusion turned to concern when he stepped outside the apartment and found himself face to face with the towering, insectoid alien with deep violet eyes. The creature chittered, waving its long fingers in what Ethan assumed was a greeting. A soft, mechanical voice translated, "You are now a cherished guest of the Zeltrax. We have provided for all your needs. You will live comfortably and safely here, as our beloved companion." Ethan's brain struggled to process the absurdity of the situation. He wasn't a prisoner, exactly. The door wasn't locked. There was food, delicious food too. Strange, alien fruit that tasted like honey and meat that melted in his mouth. A massive screen displayed movies from Earth. There were even books, though some of them appeared to be oddly curated collections of human history, highlighting things like famous dances and favorite communal rituals. He quickly realized that the Zeltrax genuinely thought of him as a pet. They observed him with curiosity, delighted when he did something amusing. They cooed when he stretched, chuckled when he yawned, and even attempted to teach him tricks, offering rewards for cooperation. Ethan, ever the adaptable survivor, decided to play along, at least until he figured out what to do next. Days passed, and Ethan began to understand his captors. The Zeltrax were meticulous, intelligent, but also strangely naive. They expected him to behave like a domesticated creature, yet they failed to grasp the nuances of human behavior. Ethan noticed how they reacted when he stared at them without blinking, how some shifted uncomfortably, their antennae twitching. He tested their patience by rearranging his enclosure just to see how they would respond. He mimicked their body language, watching how they reacted when he invaded their space the way they did his. It didn't take long for Ethan to realize that they had never encountered a creature like him before. They had no true understanding of human psychology. They had assumed he would be passive, compliant, an amusing oddity for their collection. But humans weren't prey animals. They weren't docile pets. They were something else entirely. One night, while a group of Zeltrax observed him through the transparent enclosure walls, Ethan turned off the lights. He knew they could see in the dark, but the sudden change seemed to unsettle them. He stood completely still in the shadows, barely visible, his breathing slow and deliberate. The Zeltrax murmured to one another in their clicking language, puzzled. Then, without warning, Ethan lunged at the glass, just enough to make a loud, sudden movement. The Zeltrax flinched. Ethan grinned. That was when he knew. They were afraid of him. Ethan sat cross-legged on the soft, alien flooring, his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the Zeltrax handlers observe him from the other side of the enclosure. He had spent his life studying survival, both in the wild and in social environments. He understood body language, dominance, and the way creatures, human or otherwise, responded to threats. And now, he saw it plainly. They were growing nervous. At first, they had seemed confident, treating him as a mere curiosity. But something had shifted. They were starting to notice his behavior. He wasn't behaving like a pet. He was moving too deliberately, watching too closely, acting too unpredictably. He began testing them further. When they entered his enclosure, he didn't react immediately. He simply remained still, his gaze locked on them, barely blinking. It was a simple trick, but it made them uneasy. He knew because he had done the same thing with animals back on Earth. It was the gaze of a predator assessing its prey. He started pacing sometimes, not aimlessly, but with a steady, measured rhythm. He would circle his space, stop suddenly, then continue. Occasionally, he would approach the transparent barrier between them, placing his hand against it, staring directly at one of them. If they spoke, he wouldn't respond. He simply stood there. It was a small thing, but it worked. The lower-ranking Zeltrax began shifting uncomfortably when they had to interact with him. They no longer turned their backs on him. They kept a safe distance. He could feel their unease growing. The moment they tried to train him, he knew he had them. A Zeltrax handler entered his enclosure with a device that emitted a melodic hum. A translator relayed the instructions. "When you press the circle, you will receive a reward." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't react. He had seen similar conditioning techniques before. They expected him to press the button, receive a treat, and reinforce the idea that he was obedient. Instead, he did nothing. The Zeltrax handler hesitated, clicking to his companions. The translator spoke again. "The task is simple. Press the circle. You will be rewarded." Ethan tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible smirk forming. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out, not for the button, but for the handler's wrist. He didn't grab it, didn't squeeze, didn't even hold it. He simply placed his fingers there, lightly. The handler froze. The air shifted. The moment stretched. Ethan let his fingers linger for a few seconds before pulling back, still saying nothing. He then turned around and walked away. The Zeltrax scrambled out of the enclosure. The change was immediate. The handlers no longer entered casually. They hesitated, watching him too closely, speaking in hushed voices. Ethan could hear the nervous clicking in their language. He had upended their understanding of the dynamic. The Zeltrax were a species that understood dominance. Their entire society functioned on a rigid hierarchy. By refusing to comply, by asserting subtle control, he had disrupted that hierarchy. The handlers didn't know how to react. When food was delivered, he took his time before eating, waiting until the Zeltrax grew impatient. When they tried to test his intelligence, he ignored them completely. He had turned the game around. And then, the rumors started. At first, it was small. A few handlers muttered about his behavior. Some avoided his enclosure altogether. Others hesitated before opening the doors, their antennae twitching nervously. Then came the whispers. The quiet suggestions that maybe keeping him had been a mistake. Ethan didn't need to escape. He simply needed them to believe that he was something beyond their control. The tension spread quickly. Lower-ranking Zeltrax began refusing to work near his enclosure. Highkeeper Vortek, the one who had originally chosen Ethan as a pet, grew visibly frustrated. He insisted that the human was harmless, that there was no real danger. But then, one night, Ethan stood by the transparent barrier, staring into the eyes of a passing Zeltrax guard. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared, unyielding, as if waiting for something. The guard froze, antennae quivering. Ethan exhaled slowly, fogging the glass just enough to blur his reflection. The guard turned and left in a hurry. By the next morning, 3 of the handlers had requested reassignment. Highkeeper Vortex stood before a massive holographic display, his antennae twitching erratically. The room was filled with the murmur of concerned Zeltrax scientists, their eyes scanning the data on the screen. It showed images of Earth, charts of human behavior, and, most disturbingly, footage of Ethan inside his enclosure. The human wasn't acting as expected. He wasn't displaying submission. He wasn't engaging with the tasks designed to condition him. He wasn't even attempting to escape. That was what unsettled them the most. One of the scientists, a Zeltrax named Iltrin, tapped on the display. "We assumed humans were docile creatures. A curiosity to be studied. But our findings..." The hologram shifted, showing historical footage of Earth. Primitive hunters taking down prey much larger than themselves. Soldiers strategizing in battle. Intelligence operatives using deception to manipulate entire governments. The Zeltrax murmured in concern. "This species is not prey," Iltrin continued. "They are something we have never encountered before." Vortek let out a slow chitter. "They are small, fragile, easily contained." Iltrin shook his head. "Size is irrelevant. They do not operate on physical dominance alone. They control with strategy. With patience. They wait for opportunities. And most importantly, they understand fear." The murmurs grew louder. This was not what they had anticipated. They had assumed Ethan would adapt to captivity as other creatures did. But now, they were starting to see the truth. He had been studying them. Ethan sat in his enclosure, legs stretched out, casually tossing a small object between his hands. He was aware of the increasing tension beyond the transparent walls. The way the guards hesitated before passing his space. The way they whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. He had never needed physical strength to gain control. The Zeltrax were highly intelligent, but they had a crucial weakness: their rigid social order. They were not used to creatures that could challenge that order without direct confrontation. Ethan began to push it further. Whenever a handler entered his space, he would subtly mimic their movements, shifting his posture in sync with them. When they spoke, he didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just a little too long. He positioned himself in ways that forced them to adjust their own stance. It was small, but the results were immediate. The handlers grew increasingly uneasy. They started to question whether they were the ones in control. The divide within the Zeltrax ranks widened. Some believed Ethan was dangerous. Others, like High Keeper Vortek, refused to accept that a human could be a threat. But the uncertainty was enough. It was no longer just about Ethan. It was about trust. The first real sign of their unraveling came when two handlers got into an argument outside his enclosure. Their voices were sharp, their body language tense. Ethan watched with quiet amusement. They were turning on each other, their fear of him bleeding into their own hierarchy. He didn't need to do anything. They were dismantling themselves. A meeting was called. The entire leadership of the Zeltrax expedition gathered to discuss their next move. "We must remove him," Iltrin insisted. "This situation is deteriorating." Vortek's eyes darkened. "We cannot admit failure." "It is not failure," Iltrin countered. "It is survival." Silence filled the chamber. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the conclusion was clear. The longer Ethan stayed, the worse their situation would become. The final decision was made in hushed, urgent tones. They would return him to Earth. Quietly. Ethan knew something had changed the moment the guards stopped making eye contact. The air around his enclosure was different, tense, uncertain. They were preparing for something. That night, he sat on his cot, watching the dim light shift across the ceiling. He could leave whenever he wanted. He knew that now. But there was no need to rush. They were going to let him go. All he had to do was wait. The lights flickered in Ethan's enclosure as the Zeltrax carried out their preparations. He heard the hum of the ship's engines shifting frequency, the subtle signs that they were approaching a new course. He didn't react. He simply sat, watching, waiting. When the door to his enclosure opened, it was not with the usual cautious hesitation. This time, the handlers moved with quiet urgency, their antennae twitching. The translator spoke in its usual neutral tone, but the message was different. "There has been an adjustment to your stay. You will be returned to your homeworld." Ethan stretched, taking his time before standing. "Oh, Silence. The handlers refused to meet his gaze. He smirked. No discussion. No argument. No explanation. They just wanted him gone. They led him through the pristine corridors of the mothership, past towering windows that looked out into endless space. Normally, the Zeltrax moved with an air of superiority, their posture tall and commanding. But not now. They walked stiffly, avoiding sudden movements, treating Ethan not as a guest, not even as a prisoner, but as something unknown. High Keeper Vortek was waiting at the transport bay, his normally composed expression tight with barely concealed frustration. He stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You will not speak of this," he said, his voice low. "You were never here." Ethan smiled, stepping just a little too close. Vortek stiffened. Leaning in slightly, Ethan whispered, "You were never the one in charge." Vortek's mandibles clicked shut. Ethan didn't resist as they escorted him onto the transport pod. He let them think they had the upper hand, that they were still controlling the situation. The doors sealed behind him, and in moments, the pod detached, sending him hurtling through the void of space, back toward Earth. Ethan woke up in his apartment, the early morning light filtering through his blinds. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Everything was exactly as it had been before. No missing time, no evidence of an abduction. Except for the small, metallic object sitting on his desk. He approached it slowly, turning it over in his hands. It was unlike anything on Earth, smooth, slightly warm, with shifting patterns that seemed to respond to his touch. He recognized it immediately, Zeltrax technology. A mistake. A leftover trace of their presence. Or maybe, a message. Sitting beside it was a slip of paper, written in precise, mechanical script. "Do not return." Ethan grinned. The experience should have rattled him. Should have made him question everything. Instead, it thrilled him. They had feared him. An entire alien species, far beyond humanity's technological understanding, had looked at him and decided he wasn't worth the risk. They thought they were done with him. They were wrong. Ethan spent the next few weeks studying everything he could about anomalies in space. He combed through obscure forums, looking for reports of strange activity. He mapped out disappearances, cross-referencing them with theories on extraterrestrial interference. The Zeltrax weren't the only ones out there. And if they had found Earth once, others could find it too. Ethan wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. He started small. Quiet. A few carefully placed messages in deep web forums. A cryptic post here, a suspiciously well-informed reply there. Just enough to get the right eyes looking in his direction. A week later, he received an anonymous message. Coordinates. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. Somewhere out in the galaxy, the Zeltrax were probably still warning others. Telling them that humans were unpredictable, uncontrollable. That taking one as a pet had been a mistake. Ethan smirked. Time to see if someone else wanted to make the same mistake. Ethan studied the coordinates on his screen, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. The message had been simple, no explanation, no details, just a location. Somewhere deep in the wilderness, far from prying human eyes. He had expected this. He had spent weeks setting the bait, weaving threads of misinformation and half-truths into the right corners of the internet. If someone was watching, if another species was out there looking for something, or someone, worth collecting, they would take notice. And they had. He packed light, carrying only the essentials, a knife, a few supplies, and his wits. This wasn't a normal hunt. He wasn't tracking deer or evading bears. He was stepping into the unknown, into a game where he wasn't just prey. He was both hunter and bait. The coordinates led him deep into a forest, where the air felt heavier, the silence more profound. He moved carefully, every step measured. He knew he wasn't alone. He could feel it, the unnatural stillness, the way the wind didn't quite move as it should. Then, the first sign. A shimmer in the air, barely visible. The kind of distortion that wouldn't register to most people. But Ethan had spent enough time thinking like a predator to recognize when something was watching. He didn't run. He didn't react. He just smiled. He wasn't caught in their trap. They were walking into his. The new captors were different from the Zeltrax. They didn't waste time with pleasantries or carefully constructed enclosures. They took him fast, efficiently, a flash of light and the sensation of weightlessness pulling him away from Earth in an instant. When he awoke, he was no longer in a cozy imitation of home. This time, the environment was harsh: metallic walls, a cold floor, the unmistakable scent of machinery and sterilization. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the chamber. "You are not the first human taken." Ethan blinked, adjusting to the dim lighting. Across the room stood a towering creature, reptilian in nature, its scaled body rippling with muscle. This was no Zeltrax scientist treating him like a curiosity. This was a predator. Ethan smiled. "And yet I'm the only one you'll remember." They wanted to break him. He could see it in their methods, the way they tested his limits. They weren't interested in entertainment or study. They were measuring him, assessing his strength, his endurance. They expected resistance. They expected defiance. Ethan gave them something worse. He adapted. When they locked him in darkness, he meditated. When they starved him, he conserved energy, waiting. When they studied his reactions, he gave them nothing. Predators didn't fear what they understood. They feared what they couldn't control. Days or weeks passed. The aliens grew frustrated. Their tests became more erratic. They had expected an animal. Instead, they had captured something else entirely. Ethan watched the cracks form, the subtle signs of uncertainty in their behavior. The way their commands became sharper, their observations more desperate. He waited until the perfect moment. The shift in authority was subtle at first. A glance that lingered too long. A hesitation before issuing an order. Then, small changes, guards switching their positions when he moved, reluctant to turn their backs on him. He had seen it before. The moment when confidence eroded into doubt. The final test came when they brought him before their leader, a hulking figure with dark, reflective eyes. The creature circled him, studying him with calculating precision. "You should be broken," the leader mused. "Yet you remain." Ethan met its gaze, unblinking. "Maybe you picked the wrong human." Silence. Then, a low, rumbling growl, not of anger, but of something else. Something close to respect. They didn't release him. They let him go. The stories spread quickly. Whispers in the dark corners of the galaxy. The unbreakable human. The one who couldn't be tamed. It started as a warning, a cautionary tale told among those who trafficked in rare and exotic species. But then, something changed. Some began to wonder. What made humans so different? What made them so dangerous? And most importantly, who would dare to take another? Ethan sat on his rooftop, staring up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, they were still talking about him. Still wondering. Still afraid. He smirked. Time to give them something new to fear.